If I were to ask you to name a few classic video games in the genre of science fiction and fantasy, it wouldn't be too much trouble for you to do so. Mega Man, Final Fantasy, Galaga, The Legend of Zelda, and even Sonic the Hedgehog. These are all games that most avid gamers have at least tried, and even those who don't play many video games have probably heard about them. That's because over the years, a canon of classic video games has been established that every gamer must play to fully appreciate the medium. But what if most gamers forgot about these classic video games? What if these wonderful old games were cast into the memory hole and smeared as poorly designed and racist, sexist, homophobic, etc.? What if no one played Mega Man, or The Legend of Zelda, or Sonic the Hedgehog because everyone thought that Fez and Broken Age and Cibele were much better games without all the problematic elements? When a field has been conquered, one of the first things that the enemy will do is destroy all memory of the previous culture from before they took over, and the immediate benefit of doing so is obvious. If you've never played a video game that came out before 2007, then you'll probably think that Fez is a great game. But otherwise, it'll just make you long for replaying the old Kirby games instead. Though this is far from the only reason that they would have for trying to cast the classic video game canon into the memory hole. The biggest reason why the far left wasn't able to take over video games was because of how easy it is to access the classics. Not only are there thousands of YouTube videos showing gameplay footage of everything from Metroid to Hyperdimension Neptunia, but these games are all easily downloadable from the internet. You can go right now and download the Super Famicom version of Dragon Quest with an English fan translation patch, and play it on most computers with an emulator. You can download Wizardry off of most abandonware sites. You can even purchase a digital copy of the original System Shock on GOG, and they even optimized it for modern systems. However, the ability to upload media to the internet for archival purposes is a rather recent development. Not everyone realizes this, but the far left started taking over American culture sometime in the late 30s to early 40s. Back then, computers were very primitive compared to what they are now, and the internet simply hadn't been created yet. This means that a coordinated force against the far left was all but impossible. Because leftists tend to congregate in coastal cities, such as San Francisco, while the right is scattered all across the nation, written letters were really the only reasonable means of communication for the right, while the left could just walk down the street to talk to one another. Long-distance phone calls had just been made possible a couple decades earlier, though they were not really a feasible means of communication due to their high cost. It is because of this that the far left gained much ground with very little resistance to their takeover and occupation. It was only very recently that we began taking back territory at all, and it will be a long and difficult process to win this ideological war. And today, we're going to talk about how one such field was taken over by far-left ideologues, the field of science fiction and fantasy literature. One reason why we feel it's so important to talk about this stuff, to shine a spotlight on it, is because the culture of the science fiction fandom exists more or less within a bubble, almost entirely separate from the rest of the internet. With few exceptions, the internet at large is unaware of the goings-on within the science fiction community, and reading some of the sci-fi blogs is like stepping into a time machine and returning to how internet culture was prior to the social media explosion of 2007. As an example, Jim Baen's Bar, the internet bulletin board for readers of Baen books, requires an account to even view the discussion threads. It's impossible for those outside of the board to simply lurk and observe the discussions on the forum. I mean, when was the last time you saw a cultural artifact, a meme, or an in-joke escape from the sci-fi fandom into the wider internet at large? And yet internet memes based on the Toho series of bullet hell shoot-'em-up video games and Japanese self-published comic books are everywhere online. Another reason is because the field of science fiction and fantasy literature is a territory which will be the fastest to reclaim, at least compared to the others. It's not hard to write a short story in the span of a week, and if you can write fairly quickly, it's possible to write one in a day or two. Even a novel is something which one could write in less time than it would take to, say, develop a video game, so it'll take that much less time to restore the field of science fiction than it would for Vidya. Up until quite recently, the field of science fiction was almost entirely the domain of the far left, and there really weren't very many options available for authors of other political persuasions. I was a bit skeptical of this claim when I first heard it, but research into the acquisitions editors that work for these publishing houses showed pretty much a uniform agreement of thought and belief. If you yourself aren't sure about this, I would encourage you to look up the social media accounts of the people that work for the publishing houses and see for yourself what political talking points they're parroting. Until the internet made it possible for authors to post their stories online, really the only feasible option for wrong thinkers was a small press publisher called Baen Books. But while Jim Baen didn't really care about an author's political beliefs, he did have a pretty specific idea of the sort of downbeat stories that he wanted to publish. So if one wanted to write something other than a long-running action-adventure series, then they'd be shit out of luck as far as getting an actual audience of readers. But that was the situation during the 80s and the early 90s, and things have changed quite a lot since then. Not only do authors have more options now, but there are several initiatives to restore the field to its former greatness. To help with this endeavor, we must return to when things got derailed so that we can have a better perspective moving forward. Before we go back to this time, we must give credit where credit is due. None of this would have been possible were it not for a year-long project by Jeffro Johnson, where he read the books of D&D's Appendix N, which we'll talk a bit more about later, and then wrote about how they inspired the game mechanics of Dungeons & Dragons. For without Appendix N, a literary history of Dungeons & Dragons, you would never have known about many of the wonderful stories that were published prior to the 1940s. I must also credit Nathan Housley, the pulp archivist, for starting the investigation into the events of the Campbell Age. Where his research was used, there will be a link to the blog post at the bottom of the video frame and in the description below. Also, go follow both Jeffro and Nathan on Google+. They both provide plenty of wonderful insights into the field. So, what we think of today as genres in fiction are the product of retail book chains, companies which employ stock boys who are uneducated in the world of publishing, who need products to be standardized enough for easy arrangement. If the publisher can't make it simple enough for a young adult with only high school education to stock, then the bookstores simply aren't going to sell it unless the author is a guaranteed bestseller. Sure, the Amazon category system has changed this for the better, made it easier for readers to find the sorts of books that they want to read, but it's still a bit of a relic and it's far from perfect. During the age of pulp magazines, there weren't really genres as we think of them today, but magazines which published fiction of one type or another. Instead of appealing to the cold, revenue-seeking model of big publishing houses, authors only had to write for the tastes of the editor who ran that publication. Instead of military science fiction or epic fantasy, there was amazing stories of super science and weird tales, and the Argosy. Now, Weird Tales is often thought of today as a magazine of horror stories, the likes of which have inspired such authors as Stephen King and Clive Barker. It was the magazine where many of H.P. Lovecraft's stories were first published, but it was also the magazine where most of Robert E. Howard's Conan stories were first published, as well as many others. And Weird Tales also published The Planetary Adventures of Northwest Smith by C.L. Moore. But the environment started to change in the year 1937 when John W. Campbell took over the editorship of Astounding Stories magazine, which he later renamed to Astounding Science Fiction. It's here that the seeds of our modern concept of what is and is not a science fiction story were planted. Those who preferred stories in the same vein as Edgar Rice Burroughs' A Princess of Mars or C.L. Moore's Shambleau would not find them in this magazine.
Now, it's true that in the old days there were restrictions. I know that John Campbell raised holy hell if you had, the word S-E-X in any form in any story. He was an awful prude.
From the introduction of Isaac Asimov's Before the Golden Age being the term for which Asimov refers to the age of Campbell, quote, "Very few stories published before the Golden Age have been reprinted. The coming of Campbell wiped out all that came before," end quote. And indeed, besides the collection which Isaac Asimov himself edited in the mid-70s, most of the short fiction published in Amazing Stories magazine was not reprinted until just a few years ago. And it's not just that the idea of what a real science fiction story was limited to the preferences of one man, it was also limited to a clique of writers centered around the New York City area. Barry Malzberg explains in his book, Breakfast in the Ruins, modern science fiction, generally dated as having begun in late 1937 with the ascent of Campbell, was a literature centered around a compact group of people. It was no Bloomsbury, but there could have been no more than 50 core figures who did 90% of the writing and the editing. All of them knew each other, most knew one another well, lived together, married one another, collaborated, bought each other's material, married each other's wives, and so on. For a field which was conceptually based upon expansion, the smashing of barriers, the far-reaching, and so on, science fiction was amazingly insular. one could fairly speculate that this insularity and parochialism were the understandable attempts of frightened human beings faced with terra incognita to hold on to one another and make their personal lives as limited and interconnected as possible. It could be further speculated that this parochialism shut off an entire alternative science fiction. Who is to know what writers and manuscripts not connected in any way to the Central 50 languished in slush piles, or in stamped self-addressed envelopes? Science fiction simply was not for them. It was being cooked up in offices and bars and bedrooms and apartment houses. People would stream from Central to write it all up in their own way and send it back in, and then write up next month's issue, taking the stuff already laid down in print. But the field was based upon personal access, and very few writers and stories were getting into magazines without personal acquaintance with other writers and with the editors. The first thing that Damon Knight did in the 40s as a science fiction writer manqué was to accept Fred Paul's invitation to come out from Oregon to Brooklyn and live with the Futurian Club. The young Asimov was introduced to the present contributors by Campbell before Asimov had sold a word. Malcolm Jameson, pensioned off of the Navy for medical reasons, began to write science fiction and became briefly an astounding regular in the mid-40s at the urgings of his old friend and fellow Navy officer Robert A. Heinlein. Though at this time, there were still a few other publications where one who did not have access to this Central 50 could get their science fiction story published, such as Amazing Stories or Planet Stories magazine. So those who did not write stories suited to the Campbell's taste, or who were not part of the Central 50, still had other options for getting their science fiction published. Though it was one such group that was part of the Central 50, but almost entirely outside of Campbell's stable of writers, that went on to further gatekeep the field in later years. The Futurian Society of New York was founded by Donald A. Wollheim, after he and a few of his friends had destroyed several other science fiction clubs. Prior to this, they had been part of the International Scientific Association, before William Sikora had dissolved the club, fearing a conspiracy against him. Of the many antics the Futurians got up to, the one of which I want to highlight here is something they called Michelism, named after John B. Michell, and is defined as the effort to encourage progressive political thinking among science fiction fans. Though Sam Moskowitz, the chairman of the First World Science Fiction Convention, had a much shorter definition. Quote, "It is communism," end quote.
It's a great brainwashing process.
Sometime in the early 30s, Michel joined the Young Communist League and became an ardent Marxist, another pivotal event. Through him, Wollheim and the others of his group were introduced to the communist doctrines, and several of them also joined the Young Communist League. When he was old enough, Michel became a party member. So yeah, the Futurians were a group mostly consisting of communists and communist sympathizers who wanted to use science fiction to push their political ideology. One example of this is the speech Mutation or Death, which was written by John Michel and presented by Donald Wollheim at the Third Eastern Science Fiction Convention on October of 1937. After an overly long introduction filled with amateur use of purple prose, it began, quote, "The science fiction age, as we have known it during the past few years, is over. Definitely over and done with. Dead, gentlemen, of intellectual bankruptcy," end quote. He then berated science fiction fans for looking to sci-fi stories for escapism, for not using their intellect to bring about societal change. He demanded that fans fight against his imagined tyranny. Quote, "Today we are face to face, I repeat, with the choice, civilization or barbarism, reason or ignorance," end quote. The speech concluded with, quote, "Therefore, be it moved that this, the Third Eastern Science Fiction Convention, shall place itself on record as opposing all forces leading to barbarism, the advancement of pseudosciences, and militaristic ideologies, and shall further resolve that science fiction should by nature stand for all forces working for a more unified world, a more utopian existence, the application of science to human happiness, and a saner outlook on life," end quote. Basically, John Michel and David Wollheim wanted the fandom to bring about a global Marxist utopia, using science fiction stories to do so. So when someone says that science fiction was always political, remind them that prior to the year 1937, that was not the case. Before then, science fiction was meant for entertainment, give people an escape from their dreary lives, rather than to try and convince them to start a Marxist revolution. As well-known troublemakers, it's not surprising that the Futurians were not exactly welcome within certain segments of sci-fi fandom. 6 members of the group, including Donald Wollheim himself and John Michell, were barred from entering the first Worldcon in 1939 because they were passing out yellow pamphlets that began, "Read this immediately, a warning," and "Beware of the dictatorship." Yeah, Sam Moskowitz wasn't particularly fond of this group of radicals calling him a dictator, and since they wouldn't promise not to stir up trouble, he banned them from attending the convention in what they hyperbolically called the Great Exclusion Act of 1939. Yes, Donald Wollheim and John Michell, who were themselves members of the Young Communist League, and John Michell was actually a member of the Communist Party, they objected to supposed dictators who were running the convention. Though despite this initial roadblock, many of the Futurians went on to greatly influence the field of science fiction by positioning themselves in gatekeeping roles. Frederick Pohl got a job editing the magazines Marvel Science Stories and Dynamic Stories, where the pay rates were abysmal even for the 1930s. Quote, Pohl's base rate for the 2 magazines was 1/2 cent a word, half the standard rate of Popular's other magazines. To get enough publishable material, he had to write stories for himself, and he had to get stories from his friends. And those were far from the only magazines he worked as acquisitions editor for. Fred Pohl wasn't the only one from the Futurians to work in a position of deciding which stories to accept for publication at a sci-fi magazine, and which stories to reject. Larry Shaw edited Infinity Science Fiction for 4 years, and Science Fiction Adventures for 3. Robert A.W. Lowndes edited more magazines than we could list, and Donald A. Wollheim himself edited Avon Fantasy Reader for several years, among other publications. But we'll talk more about Donnie's career in sci-fi publishing a little later. And then there's Damon Knight, who edited numerous anthologies and publications of science fiction. He also had a lasting influence with the institutions which he founded, and the literary criticism which he gave towards certain classic works in the genre. This is the man who helped found the Clarion Writers Workshop, the National Fantasy Fan Federation, and the Science Fiction and Fantasy Writers of America. Hell, the NFFF was inspired by a speech by Damon Knight that was a retread of Mutation or Death, called Unite or Phi. The NFFF was made to replace New Fandom, the group Sam Moskowitz created in opposition to the Futurians in the decade prior. Now, Damon Knight was also very influential as a critic of science fiction, and much of his criticism was collected in his book, In Search of Wonder. Here is what he thought of Robert E. Howard's Conan stories. Howard's tales lack the Elsprog de Camp's verisimilitude. Howard never tried, or never tried intelligently, to give his preposterous saga the ring of truth. But they have something that De Camp's stories lack: a vividness, a color, a dream dust sparkle, even when they're most insulting to the rational mind. Howard had the maniac's advantage of believing whatever he wrote. De Camp is too wise to believe wholeheartedly in anything. Oh no, a fictional story about events that didn't actually happen. The horror! The horror! All the great fantasies, I suppose, have been written by emotionally crippled men. Howard was a recluse, and a man so morbidly attached to his mother that when she died he committed suicide. Lovecraft had enough phobias and eccentricities for 9. Merritt was chinless, bald, and shaped like a shmoo. The trouble with Conan is that the human race never produced and never could produce such a man, and sane writers know it. Therefore, the sick writers have a monopoly on him. Yeah, you might notice the lack of actual criticism towards the stories these writers actually wrote. I mean, you don't read The Ship of Ishtar because you have a particular fondness for A. Merritt's good looks. Hell, the only time he mentions the actual story itself is to complain about the appearance of a naked woman. Such degeneracy. Anyway, a couple chapters later, there was a reprinting of Damon Knight's essay Cosmic Jerry Builder, A.E. Van Vogt, the essay that is responsible for diminishing Van Vogt's legacy as a writer of science fiction tales. Before this essay, A.E. Van Vogt was one of the most popular and well-read writers in the field, someone who originally stood next to Robert A. Heinlein as one of the big 3. Most of Damon Knight's review consists of an extended plot summary of Van Vogt's novel The World of Null A, where he criticizes the story's internal logic. In a way, his criticism is sort of a precursor to reviewers like Nostalgia Critic, who give Cliff Notes-esque summaries of movies while complaining about plot holes both real and imaginary. His complaints about Null A's supposed shortcomings are the same sort used by modern critics to dismiss the original Star Wars trilogy as a badly plotted series of films full of fake science. You see, Damon Knight had a very specific definition of what does and does not qualify as science fiction, as this clip shows.
Lucian's true history is a story in which the narrator is caught up in a waterspout and carried to the moon. And I think that's science fiction to just about the extent that the whirlwind that carried Elijah to heaven is.
Yeah, a story about a man traveling to the moon isn't real science fiction. That could never happen in reality. Anyway, in the year 1952, Donald A. Wollheim was hired by the Ace Magazine Company to form the paperback book imprint Ace Books. And it was at Ace Books that he started the event which would forever change the face of fantasy literature. Today, The Lord of the Rings by J.R.R. Tolkien is one of the best-selling books in the English language. But when it first came out in the UK, the only way for American readers to buy it was by purchasing one of the limited imports from Houghton Mifflin during a short 5-year window. Donald Wollheim wanted to purchase the rights to publish a paperback version with Ace Books, but Tolkien had rejected his offer. Quote, Tolkien said he would never allow his great works to appear in so degenerate a form as the paperback book, end quote. But after being rejected, Donald Wollheim got it into his head that The Lord of the Rings was somehow in the American public domain, because Houghton Mifflin had not renewed the copyright for the books. So, despite J.R.R. Tolkien being alive and well at this time, Donald Wollheim went ahead and published The Lord of the Rings in paperback with Ace Books. Yeah, the first American edition of The Lord of the Rings was a pirated version, of which the actual author of the books was not being paid. This isn't small-scale piracy, like downloading a book off the internet for personal use, where it's debatable whether or not a sale was actually lost. Ace Books, with Donald Wollheim behind the wheel, was selling unauthorized copies of the Ring trilogy. So it's undeniable that the people who bought those books had the money and desire to actually pay for them. And these books went on to sell over 100,000 copies, which Tolkien didn't see a single cent from, until he proved in a court of law that the books were actually still under copyright. Now, despite pulling such a foolish and unethical stunt, Donald Wollheim somehow continued to have an editorial career at Ace Books for several years, until he left the company in 1971 to found Daw Books. He managed the company for almost 30 years until his death in 1990, when his daughter took over and ran Daw Books straight into the ground. During his time at Ace and Daw, Donald Wollheim had published numerous popular writers of high regard, while Elizabeth Wollheim debuted only 2 writers of note. Patrick Rothfuss, who wrote a single fantasy novel divided into 3 parts, and of which the third has yet to be finished, and Seanan McGuire, who believes that the 45th President of the United States is actually Voldemort. So after the Ace editions came out, Tolkien was convinced that us Yanks might actually have sophisticated enough taste to like his books, even if we did prefer to buy them in stodgy paperback form. So he was finally convinced to sell the American publishing rights to Ballantine Books. Due to the trilogy's massive success with the company, Ballantine started the Adult Fantasy series, which was edited by Lynn Carter, who had worked as a consultant for their previous fantasy releases. But after Random House bought Ballantine Books in the early 70s, the line was soon dropped, as it wasn't a particularly good moneymaker for the company. But they still kept printing The Lord of the Rings, which was continuing to grow in popularity. So even though the Ballantine Adult Fantasy line wasn't as profitable as Random House would have liked, readers were still buying fantasy books in droves. This brings us to the formation of Del Rey Books, founded by Lester Del Rey and Judy Lynn Del Rey, as a branch of Ballantine Books. The first novel published by Del Rey was The Sword of Shannara, an epic fantasy by Terry Brooks. Marketed towards fans of Tolkien's Ring trilogy, the book went on to sell very well for Del Rey, and it became the model for how books in the fantasy genre were written, inspiring many other authors to try their hand at copying Tolkien. Before the supposed explosion of the fantasy genre, that type of book was synonymous with Robert E. Howard's Conan series. Decades before Arnold Schwarzenegger took on the title role for Conan the Barbarian, the Conan stories were the model for which most other fantasy stories were written, such as Fafhrd and the Grey Mouser by Fritz Leiber, 3 Hearts and 3 Lions by Poul Anderson, and Elric of Melniboné by Michael Moorcock. But with the birth of the epic fantasy genre, now every story had to be some kind of grand quest about saving the world. While Tales of Swords and Sorcery tended to be on the shorter length, often simply collections of short stories, the epic fantasy book had to go on for several hundred pages in length. To be frank, the variety of stories one could tell in the epic fantasy tradition is much more limited than that of sword and sorcery fiction. To make matters worse, in the year 1979, the Thor Power Tool Company versus Commissioner of Internal Revenue legal case went to court, and the book publishing industry was changed overnight. Before then, publishers used a legal loophole to get out of paying taxes on inventory backlists, but afterwards, they couldn't turn a profit on the older titles, so a wealth of science fiction and fantasy's history went out of print overnight. Though there are records of how things existed before the Thor Power case, memories of the science fiction and fantasy canon of the 70s. There's still records of the Ballantine adult fantasy line that Lynn Carter put together, and there's also Appendix N of the Dungeons Master Guide for Advanced Dungeons & Dragons. When Gary Gygax created D&D, he took inspiration from many of the fantasy books that were popular in the 70s, which he listed on Appendix N to inspire other Dungeon Masters when creating their campaigns. Quote, "The most immediate influences on AD&D were probably DeCamp and Pratt, R.E. Howard, Fritz Leiber, Jack Vance, H.P. Lovecraft, and A. Merritt. But all of the above authors, as well as many not listed, certainly helped to shape the form of the game. For this reason, and for the hours of reading enjoyment, I heartily recommend the works of these fine authors to you." See, D&D was kind of a holdout in the world of fantasy, at least for a while. While fantasy literature in the late 70s started imitating Tolkien over and over, the original Dungeons & Dragons stayed true to the sort of adventures that one found in other fantasy stories. It really wasn't until later editions that the influence of Tolkien and his many imitators started to show. But of course, readers did tire of the endless Tolkien clones after some time, and longed for something new in the genre to read. And this brings us to A Game of Thrones by George R.R. Martin, which was published in 1996, and is thought to have breathed new life into the fantasy genre with a new gritty tone. But really, many of the qualities that critics praise in the series can be found in Robert E. Howard's Phoenix on the Sword, the very first Conan story. Often, those that praise the Song of Fire and Ice books mention few, if any, fantasy books published before Shannara that they had read. And since many of the classic works of fantasy are out of print and hard to find, it's no wonder that their frame of reference would only go back as far as Shannara. So of course anything that went outside of that would be mind-blowing. George R.R. Martin's success with the Song of Fire and Ice series, much like Tolkien's Ring trilogy, spawned many imitators, because the editors working for the big publishing houses got it into their heads that this was how fantasy books were supposed to be done. After the new gritty wave, there were a few other trends in fantasy as well, such as the new weird started by China Miéville, the historical fantasy trend started by Naomi Novik, and the interesting magic systems trend started by Brandon Sanderson. But these trends still continue to ignore the problem of having a narrow frame of reference. All of these passing fads ignore the primary reasons why readers were getting sick of the endless Tolkien clones. Despite all the attempts at getting away from Tolkien's influence, they still cling to the rules of how fantasy was supposed to be written. For all the talk of how much of a subversion A Game of Thrones is towards Tolkien's work, it was still limited by the need for fate of the world stakes and a bloated length, as were the stories that tried to cash in on it. They were still beholden to the chain bookstore demands for every book to fit into neat little boxes, so that employees who knew nothing about the publishing industry could easily place each book in the right section of the store. You couldn't do anything really groundbreaking in the genre because the bookstores just wouldn't sell it, and so readers wouldn't be able to buy it either. And even with the closing of Borders and the explosion of the Amazon Kindle store, the big publishers still hold themselves to the old model, and only publish books that can be easily shelved in the right section. But now that we have the internet, there's really nothing to stop us from writing whatever the hell kind of stories we want and selling them over the internet. We can even pick right up from where the grandmasters of science fiction and fantasy left off, as many of the older pulps have been scanned and posted to archive.org, and many others can be bought on the Kindle store. The machinery of book publishing has run amok, and it's time for a revolution. A pulp revolution.